So now to the second part of the talk, which is less number orientated and more clinical and theoretical, and that is about the theory and technique of working at the Portman Clinic with our particular type of patient, and the key concepts that we sort of developed and worked with, which we called Portman Lore, L-O-R-E, meaning things that we knew about that might be written down, but we all just were imbued with it. Right, so let's start with this part now. Yes, okay. Now, I mentioned the core complex earlier, which was a concept developed by Mervyn Glasser, and I was lucky enough to be part of the violence research workshop when he was developing his ideas. One of the most central aspects of working at the clinic was to understand how the core complex works, why it works, what it's about. I'll explain that in a moment, but every chapter in the book that I brought up and showed you earlier will mention the core complex pretty well, because it just runs like a thread through all of the thinking and understanding about how you work with these very troubled patients, traumatized patients. Okay, so the core complex. This is part of normative development in toddlerhood and is ultimately about difficulties with intimacy and separation. We can all have this to a greater or lesser degree. It's about how to be with another without feeling taken over and controlled by the other, and how to be separate without feeling utterly alone and empty. But for violent and perverse patients, these anxieties are extremely intense and crippling. Mervyn Glasser describes how such patients struggle to deal with the contrasting anxieties of being intruded upon, engulfed, overwhelmed and taken over by the other on the one hand, and on the other hand of being abandoned by the object, completely lost and alone. In other words, too much or not enough closeness or intimacy. Underlying both anxieties is a primitive terror of annihilation. Annihilation because of being taken over by another and therefore losing oneself, or annihilation because of being too separate and therefore feeling lost, abandoned and disintegrated. When feeling engulfed by another, the individual tries to protect himself by moving away from that person. But he then experiences the opposite of anxiety, of being abandoned and alone, and so he moves towards the other again. It's an impossible situation, and the patient swings back and forth between these two extremes, desperately trying to find a position of safety. The core complex originates in the anal stage of pre-Oedipal development outlined in the Freudian developmental model, where issues of separation, individuation, control and aggression are prominent, and the dyadic relationship with the mother is most central. Typically in the history of patients who have this particular problem, there is a mother whose narcissistic needs take precedence over her child's needs, so that the child cannot experience a safe emotional closeness with her, and his capacity to develop a valued sense of himself as separate and different from her is severely compromised. Never being able to feel seen as himself, but only as a narcissistic extension of the mother, leads to extreme narcissistic vulnerability in the child and intense sensitivity to feelings of humiliation and helplessness. The lack of an emotionally available father further prevents the child from being able to experience a more healthy attachment relationship and find appropriate separateness from the damaging tie to a narcissistic mother. And when I say a narcissistic mother, it's not just about the mother's narcissism in terms of her own narcissism being damaged. That's usually the case. But sometimes it's about a mother who's so depressed that she can't actually see her child as separate, that she's enclosed in her own depression. Glasser emphasised the central role of aggression and its sexualisation in the core complex dilemma. Fear of the mother, who is experienced as annihilatory because she's abandoning or engulfing or humiliating, fear of that mother arouses rage and an urge to destroy her. But then there's the desperate longing to reach her and the need to preserve her so as to be protected from abandonment and terrifying aloneness. Faced with this insoluble paradox of constantly trying to find a safe distance to preserve both the object and himself, he resorts unconsciously to sexualizing the aggression. That is sadomasochism. Sadomasochism, whether as a full sadomasochistic sexual perversion or a habitual way of relating without actual bodily expression, then becomes the attempted solution used to defend against core complex terrors. This enables the feared but much needed object to be held onto at arm's length, therefore not too close, not too distant, safely in his control. Glasser contrasts sadomasochistic aggression with self-preservative aggression. Sadomasochistic aggression aims to maintain the tie at a safe psychic distance to the other, whereas self-preservative aggression aims to eliminate the other. Now, if something breaks through the sadomasochistic defense, core complex anxieties and the ultimate terror of annihilation resurface in full force. The other is now perceived as threatening the survival of the self and so has to be destroyed. Self-preservative aggression then erupts in physical violence out of sheer panic for psychic survival. We would have a similar action if faced with a tiger in the jungle with no means of escape. We would want to kill it, not tease it. In considering a sadomasochistic relationship, one can fall into the trap of seeing one person as the sadistic perpetrator, who attacks and controls the other, as the masochistic victim. However, one important element of what we call Portman law is that both parties can be sadistic as well as masochistic, and both exert some control over the other. For example, a teenage girl who is punched by her boyfriend is clearly the, quote, victim of his physical attack. But it is very likely that she might have been criticizing, dismissing, or mocking him in some way, and he may have felt then the masochistic victim of her sadistic verbal or non-verbal slights and assaults, especially on his image of himself as a strong man. And these assaults then felt so provocative, controlling and undermining that they broke through his sadomasochistic defense against core complex anxieties and caused him to erupt with this self-preservative aggression. This way of thinking, of course, does not condone physical violence or lay blame on victims of abuse. But it does help us to understand how violence can become an integral part of a relationship which can't exist without it. It also helps prevent the split of taking sides in relation to, quotes, the perpetrator and the victim, which often occurs in the physical network concerned with such cases, as both parties in the scenario are understood as suffering from core complex anxieties, each with a mostly unconscious part to play in what happens. Sadomasochism isn't only a habitual mode of relating between the individual and other people. Very importantly, it also features heavily in the interplay between parts of the patient's own mind. Due to early environmental impingements, these patients have a persecuting superego and an ego that isn't sufficiently developed to be able to process feelings and anxieties and protect the self appropriately. With insufficient ego strength to intervene, the sadistic superego attacks and overwhelms the self, humiliating and torturing it with its punitive voice. But it also abandons the self by allowing it no real self-esteem This dynamic often reflects the child's experience of overpowering or neglectful parents, and the lack of any stable self-esteem was a characteristic of all Portman patients. The intricacies of the core complex soon become central to the way Portman staff understood that any potential intimate relationship, including that with the therapist, is a terrifying threat to the patients. This has huge implications for technique and requires very sensitive handling. If the stability of the patient's defensive sadomasochistic way of relating is threatened because he feels engulfed or abandoned by the therapist, or if his very fragile narcissism is undermined because he feels humiliated, the patient is likely to erupt in violent aggression as a kind of knee-jerk, last-ditch attempt at psychic self-preservation. To avoid increasing the patient's anxieties and breaching their much-needed defences, we have to be extremely careful about what we say, and especially how we say things, as the patient will so easily feel intruded upon, controlled, neglected, dismissed, humiliated, and criticised. Out of awareness of the patient's underlying core complex fears and the importance of respecting his needs to keep at a safe enough distance from the therapist, Portman staff always place the patient's chair rather than the therapist's chair nearest the door, to give the patient the security that he could escape if his anxiety becomes overwhelming, rather than needing to resort to physical attack on the therapist in order to get out of the door. Also, alarm buzzers were never introduced into consulting rooms at the clinic, despite the fact that many risky patients were in therapy. Unfortunately, this kind of psychoanalytic thinking has been replaced by action in many other settings today, where risk is managed by the installation of alarm buzzers, glass screens, and coded doors. This can lead patients to feel that their therapist perceives them as horribly dangerous and unbearable to be with, which is likely to arouse feelings of humiliation and fears of being taken over or abandoned, and actually intensify the risk of their destructiveness. Don Campbell, who I mentioned earlier as being one of the most influential child psychotherapists who has ever worked at the Portman Clinic, he candidly illustrates how he initially came to understand this with one of his first violent Portman adult patients. He's written about this patient and calls him Mr. D. Mr. D had been referred for habitually getting involved in pub fights after heavy drinking, often using broken bottles as weapons. After discussing Mr. D's early sessions with colleagues, who asked if it was safe to have a glass ashtray within Mr. D's reach, Don Campbell decided to remove the ashtray, but soon realised that this resort to action was a mistake. He had failed to recognise, he says, that the ashtray was an important potential weapon that enabled Mr. D to feel safe in the presence of the analyst as a very dangerous transference figure. Removing the ashtray disarmed Mr. D and increased his feelings of helplessness. This heightened his core complex terrors and actually put his analyst more at risk of Mr. D's violence. Instead of feeling in the presence of someone strong and steady enough to contain and help him, Mr. D felt that his analyst was afraid of him and therefore wouldn't be able to see him as a whole person. Don Campbell reflected, quotes, "By acting as I did, I confirmed that I also dealt with my fears by resorting to action, and that I, like all the authorities he had faced before, could not and would not think about his violence with him, but that I would have to do something about it. If I had thought more about the transference, and especially been more sensitive to my counter-transference, I could have been more helpful to Mr. D." Child psychotherapists are trained to provide a box of toys appropriate for each patient. But before starting at the Portman, I discovered the benefit of having a cupboard in the room for general use, containing play items for both boys and girls of all age groups. I'd been sharing a room with another child psychotherapist where there was such a toy cupboard, which I'd originally been very sniffy about. But it proved enormously helpful when I started seeing an 8-year-old boy whose mother worried about his aggressive outbursts at home and his compulsive dressing up in girls' clothes, a boy dressing up in girls' clothes. He was very inhibited with me at first and resisted any fantasy play. But after a while, he asked me to close my eyes and went over to the big cupboard. Moments later, he asked me to open my eyes, and I saw a lace-gloved hand bedecked with plastic rings waving shyly at me as he hid behind my desk. From there on, he used fantasy play with the, quote, girly dressing up things in the big cupboard to express his wish to be a girl and his conflicts about being a boy, which turned out to be his fear of aggression, terror of separating from his mum, and anxiety about growing up. Towards the end of therapy, he pretended to be a young deer, rubbing his head against a tree and telling me with enormous pride that his antlers weren't fully grown yet, but each year they would get bigger until he had ones like his dad. So at the Portman, I introduced a similar cupboard for general use, and it continued to be very useful there. For example, with youngsters confused about their sexual identity, and those who needed to have the opportunity to regress and express their infantile needs through play, for example with using the dolls or a baby's bottle. Play offers an arena for expressing feelings and experiences that can't be put into words, and where anxieties, feelings and urges that would otherwise be enacted with the body can be displaced safely. With all children, but especially those with core complex anxieties, it's important to be engaged with and to share the child's play, but not, of course, to intrude by interpreting potential underlying meanings too early. Otherwise, the child's core complex anxieties will be intensified because of feeling threatened by an abandoning or engulfing object. Allowing the play to unfold at its own pace gives the child the experience of being with a different kind of object, with whom a different kind of relating may be possible. The child may now be able to experience their previously unmet needs for concern for their well-being and appropriate care and attentiveness being met by the therapist as a new developmental object. What applies to playing with younger children also applies to the way of listening to and talking with older children and adolescents. My patient Tom, aged 17, instigated violent fights with boys and had attempted to rape a girl at knife point. He found it very hard to be in the room with me and would stare silently at me with a penetrating gaze which felt both intrusive and dismissive. But underneath his intimidating stare, I sensed his fear of me. He wanted me to ask questions, but would then feel intruded upon, and if I stayed silent, he seemed to experience me as not being interested or bothered about him. This made his core complex dilemma very clear. He felt both engulfed and abandoned by me, and I felt similarly in relation to him. Eventually, I said that I had a dilemma to think about with him, that I thought that my words, as well as my silence, made him feel very uncomfortable, and that he seemed to feel very unsafe in the room with me. As I tried to explore his discomfort with me, it emerged that he found all verbal communication difficult. He felt he had nothing interesting to say and that nobody noticed him. I said this must make him feel terribly lonely. It might even be hard for him to feel that he was a somebody worthy of notice. Perhaps it was as if he even felt invisible. He agreed and said that the only thing that would always make people pay attention to him was when he talked about his racist political opinions. It didn't matter whether the person agreed or disagreed. All that mattered was to get an intense reaction. I linked this urgent need to get through to people with... lost my place. I linked this urgent need to get through to people with his helpless isolation of never having felt noticed in a good way by his parents, especially his mother. I wondered if the only way he felt he could make an impact on someone was by force, by his forceful political views or his physical violence. This seemed to reach him, and he responded thoughtfully by saying for the first time that he felt helpless and vulnerable sometimes. Tom had built a pseudo-identity as a tough guy to protect himself from feeling vulnerable to humiliation, abandonment and intrusiveness. With violent and negating parents and no age-appropriate allowance for omnipotence in early childhood, the smallest humiliation was experienced by Tom as the most terrible trauma. Underneath a presentation of himself as an all-powerful young man, there was a frightened and humiliated child whose only way of protecting himself from overwhelming insensitivity to feeling a rejected nobody was to act violently. Coldly calculated violence shaped his identity so that he could try to avoid dealing with terrifying core complex anxieties and therefore would not experience the ultimate threat to his psychic survival. When a patient was referred, be it for a risk assessment, consultation for the professional network, a court report, or a potentially psychotherapy patient, we sought all possible material on the patient and often ended up with massive amount of reports, some of which had missed out vital details of the patient's history. So one of the most important first tasks was to compile a detailed and comprehensive background history of the patient to ensure that we got as full a picture as possible of the patient's development and to ensure that important facts or events did not get lost. This in itself could often help professionals when we also offered psychoanalytic understanding in very ordinary language about how the patient's offending behaviour was their attempted unconscious solution to the terrors, anxieties and conflicts in their internal world. When patients came for an assessment, they were usually extremely resistant and very anxious, even if they tried to cover up their fear by apparent bravado, as they seemed convinced that they would only be perceived as bad because of their problematic behaviours. One of my adolescent boy patients said later in therapy that it was as if he had child abuser tattooed on his forehead. It's vital to help the youngster to see that we can appreciate their positive characteristics and not only focus on their problems. Because of their traumatic experiences and the lack of good enough care in their early years, their emotional development has been stunted and skewed. And so, as Anna Freud noted in writing about very aggressive children, the appropriate therapy has to be directed to the neglected defective side, that is, the emotional libidinal development. To foster this development and enhance the youngster's self-esteem and capacity to be curious about himself, it is of vital importance to help him to feel seen by the therapist as a whole person, with strengths which can be valued, as well as weaknesses that need help. This offers hope to the patient and is essential for a move towards healthy behaviour. Thank you.
Thank you.